What's up, hobby friends? In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I paint the redstone of Szarakh's Menhirs as well as his dais. I also ended up using the exact same color combination on Szarakh's cape. In order to make these videos as informative as possible, I have included as much of the painting process as necessary. However, in the interest of cutting down on the video time and length, I have chosen to speed up these parts. If you want to skip these parts and just jump to the next step, you can use the timestamp links in the video description below. So to paint the purple pink color on the menhirs, I'm going to be using 6 different colors. So for my base coat, I'm going to be using Scale 75's Deep Blue. And then we're going to be airbrushing a couple of steps to form our initial base coats and highlights. So we're going to start with Deep Blue. We're going to slowly mix in some of the Scale Color Bloodfest Crimson, Vallejo's Fantasy Pro Devil Red, and then a touch of Scale 75's Fuschia. So these 4 colors we're going to be pumping through the airbrush, and they're going to form our initial base coat and highlights. On top of that, we're then going to be hand painting Fuschia, first diluted, then more of a pure color. And then we're going to mix in some Hykey Yellow for the highlights. And that's where we're going to be focusing some of our brighter points around the center of the energy orb. Once we've done all of that, we're going to go back in with an airbrush. We're going to add in a couple of shadow filters, first with our Bloodfest Crimson and Deep Blue, and then our Hexed Lichen for some of our deepest shadows. To achieve some of the glowing color around the energy orb that you see here, we paint the orb as normal using our Caribbean Blue, Oxide, and White. And then mixing in with our Fuchsia color, we combine these colors. So first Caribbean Blue and Fuchsia together, and then we do glazes of Oxide to tint the color around the orb. And that's how we achieve this effect here, which I'll show you after we've done the initial pink. So a couple of things to cover before I dive into the airbrushing. The first is that we need to mask off some of the areas that we want to protect. So I've already base coated the blue on this energy orb. So I want to get some blue tack or masking tape and just cover this up so that we don't airbrush on top of it. Now, I'm going to be painting this blue orb after I do the airbrushing, simply because if I paint this blue beforehand, it becomes much harder to mask off and still be able to paint the inside of the colors, or the colors on the inside of the circle. The second is that while I normally tend to or prefer to hand paint all of my base coats and highlights instead of airbrushing them, I have found that these 2 colors don't cover very, very well by hand. They're fairly diluted out of the bottle, and I find if I don't airbrush them, I'm not going to get a very strong coverage unless I do tons and tons of coats, which takes a lot of time, and it doesn't give me a perfectly smooth finish, hence why we're pushing them through the airbrush. One last thing to note is that I tend to mix my colors and thin them directly in the airbrush. There is a technique to doing this to prevent clogging, and I'm going to quickly walk through it before I start airbrushing, simply because once I'm airbrushing, I have to move fairly quickly to prevent the paint from settling in and clogging up the airbrush. You don't have to do it this way. You can pre-mix the paints in a separate paint container, something like this little cup or whatever you tend to use. It's up to you. This is just the way I do it. This is the way I paint, and it works pretty quickly and well for me. So you can follow along if you want to. So the 2 most important parts we need to thin our airbrush with are water and airbrush flow improver. Before each color, we're going to preload a couple of drops of the flow improver, and then we're going to add in our water. Now, the amount that we use is going to be impacted by how much of the paint we want to mix in the pot. So if I'm doing a large base coat, or I know I'm going to be covering or have to cover a large amount of area with paint, I'm going to need a lot of paint in the airbrush, which means I'll probably need more flow improver and water to get the consistency I want. If I'm going to be doing something like a more limited highlight stage focused around just this area, I don't need as much paint, and so conversely, I don't need as much thinner or water. How much you use is up to you. Just gauge, I guess just eyeballing sort of the ratio that you want, and go by experience. I usually aim for a 50-50 mix initially of water to paint, sometimes more paint than water if I know that they're fairly diluted out of the bottle. And then usually for half of this cup, I will put in 2 or 3 drops of flow improver. And that's just something I've learned through my experience using this airbrush for a few years now. A technique that I also use to help mix the paint. So once I've gotten the flow improver and the water into the cup, when I apply or when I squirt my paint in, I want to make sure that I'm squirting the paint on the side well of the cup. I want to squirt the paint in a way where it's not going to sink right to the bottom immediately. It's going to hover there on the surface, and that's going to give me enough time to mix the paint in with the water. The way I'm going to mix the paint is I'm going to slowly push it into the water surface and stir as I go so that by the time I reach to the bottom of the cup, it's been fully mixed. And then just to very quickly agitate the paint a little more, I cover up the nozzle, I press down and I pull. And if I've created a strong enough seal where none of the water, none of the paint or air flows through the airbrush, it ends up being backwashed and pushed back through the airbrush, and it'll agitate the paint. You'll see a bubble, and that's when you know that it's been mixed thoroughly. So to show you what I mean very quickly with the paint agitation. So drop a flow improver. I'm going to get some water. Covering the nozzle and pulling back. You see that it's not agitated, it's agitating. And what's happening is the air is being forced back through the airbrush into the paint cup, and it's going to help thoroughly mix up the paint and water that we have in the airbrush. So we're just going to quickly use our blue tack, and we're just going to mask off. Now, I prefer using blue tack. I've found that painter's tape or masking tape doesn't always work as effectively. They say it's low tack, but I found that it can sometimes pull off paint even with a low tack masking tape, and I don't want to risk pulling off or damaging parts of the model that I may have already painted or pulling off some of the primer. I like this blue tack. It's very soft, it's malleable. I can push it around to where I need to, so it's much easier to use than masking tape. And then when I pull it off, it doesn't leave or it doesn't pull off any of the paint. It's very easy to clean up, and it's reusable. So this is my preferred method of masking. So with the blue masked off, it's now time to airbrush our base coats and highlights. So once again, I'm not going to be talking through the entire process because of the airbrush noise in the compressor. I'm going to be editing it out, and we'll just speed through it. So once again, I'm going to start with a base coat of Deep Sea Blue, and then we're going to mix in progressive amounts of Crimson, Devil Red, and then up to Fuchsia. We're not going to go pure Fuchsia, simply because that's going to be our final highlight by hand, but we're going to go almost up to this color, and we're just going to push that through the airbrush. And that's the airbrushing done. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this aside to dry. We're going to clean the airbrush, and then we're going to come back in and start adding in our brushwork. So now that we have our base coats and initial highlights done with the airbrush, it's time to go in by hand and start to refine some of these highlights and to add in some texture into the stone. One of the things I don't like about an airbrush finish is it's a little too perfect, and when you look at it, you can tell that it's been airbrushed. There's a certain almost a fuzzy finish to it, regardless of how smooth or how well that you've mixed the colors, where you can tell that it's been airbrushed. And if we don't go back in and work it by hand, it doesn't have that final quality or that polish of a hand painted miniature. At least that's what I found from my personal experience. So you can see in this finished Menhir, I've really gone in and just roughly painted the stonework with my highlights, and it adds that bit of a finish to it, that hand painted quality that I really love of the miniatures. So we're going to be doing that in our next step. So to do this, we're going to need two colors. We're just going to be using our Bloodfest Crimson and Fuchsia. Now, Fuchsia is going to be our primary color, and that's going to be where we're concentrating our highlights, particularly on the top half. But as we get down to some of the darker elements, we're going to find that pure fuchsia is too strong. And so what we're going to do is we're going to mix in some of this Bloodfest Crimson to knock back some of that color to get some of these highlights near the bottom half. And we're really just going to put less and less texture until we hit the bottom, at which point we're okay leaving it at just this deep dark color. Because once we've gone over that with our initial or our brush strokes, we're going to return with an airbrush filter of Hexed Lichen, and that's going to tie everything together. It's going to help create that bit of a smoother fade transition, and it's really just going to darken this to the point where any brush strokes we have no longer really exist. So we're not going to spend too much time on this lower quarter of the Menhir. So we're going to start by working the bottom half of the Menhir. To do that, we're just going to mix in, we'll call it 50-50, maybe 60-40 crimson to the fuchsia. And we're just going to start seeing how bright this color looks. And we're just going to tweak it as we go down, as we work our way down to the bottom of the Menhir. We're just going to slowly mix in a little more crimson and really roughly just start working in that texture. Now the Menhir itself has a sculpted textural surface to it, so you can follow along, use that as your guide, and then I'm sort of just pushing on brushstrokes, and wherever it happens to go, it'll create that bit of an extra texture to it. I'm not trying to be too precise with this step. The real key is to just cover up that initial airbrush transition and to introduce some brushstrokes for that textural element. And you can see that as I get to the bottom quarter, bottom fifth, I'm just taking pure Bloodfest Crimson, and I'm just roughly hitting the tops of these stones. So now that we've introduced some brush strokes and worked in some of the texture on the bottom half, we're now going to work in with our pure fuchsia, and we're going to focus on the top half of the menhir. You can see that I've also picked out some of the edges with a bit of a brighter highlight, and we're just going to continue reinforcing that as we go, working our way up towards the center of the menhir. If you find that pure fuchsia is a little too bright for some of these portions, again, just mix in a bit of crimson, darken it up a bit, and just work your brush strokes in. Be careful to preserve these cracks in the blackstone, and then the menhirs on both halves have this inscribed rune work that you want to be careful not to fill too much with in color, because what we're going to do afterwards is we're going to go in with some oil paints and we're going to just very quickly pin wash those. So if you put too much paint in those because they are very lightly inscribed, you're going to find that the oils are much harder to apply. So just be careful at the step around those runes to not fill them in with too much paint. And that's it for our fuchsia highlights. And you can see that I've gone to pure fuchsia right around the center orb, and I sort of worked my way out, highlighting from bright to dark, using the orb as my central radius. I've also picked up some of these brighter edges and corners from the top of the menhir. So the way I'm highlighting it is sort of twofold. I'm treating the orb as a light source for all these radial elements from the inside. So this entire panel is highlighted as if there's a light source emanating from here. And then I'm highlighting the rest of the black stone as if there's my ambient directional light, which will be 3/4 top down. With this face done, with this half done, we're going to then repeat the process on the back half of the menhir. Now, normally I would not highlight the back of a model as bright. However, these models are fairly unidirectional, and I don't want to have to be able to keep track of which side's the front, which side's the back at any point during the game. So I'm going to highlight the back to the same level of brightness as the front. That way I can use either side as the front or back without issue. So again, we're just going to repeat this highlighting process, this rough texturing on the back, and then we will proceed with the next step. So we've painted both sides with our refined highlights of crimson and fuchsia. Before we can proceed, we want to do a quick glaze to help tie in some of these blends, smooth out some of the roughness, and just add a bit more depth back to the bottom of the menhir and then just the corners. You can do this by hand, but I'm actually going to show you an easy way to do this by airbrush. Just like before, when we were base coating with the airbrush, we're going to be mixing all of our colors directly in the cup. However, instead of going more of a 50-50, like even mix of water and paint, we're actually going to go probably 9 or 10 parts water with a drop or two of the flow improver to 1 drop of paint. And really what that's going to give us is a very thin glaze that we're going to then spray onto the model at a reduced PSI. So when I'm airbrushing base coats and primer through the airbrush, I have my compressor set at 40 to 45 PSI, give or take 2.5 to 3 bar. For this step, when we're going to be glazing with the airbrush, we actually want to drop the PSI to somewhere around maybe 10 or 15. So that's about 1 bar, maybe 1.5, depending on the color and how heavy or light you want to go. And so the way we're going to do this, I'm just going to quickly talk you through the technique before I actually get into doing it. So we're using a double action airbrush, so obviously pressing down for air, and we pull back to release paint from the cup. The motion that we want to do when we do this glaze is, so we press for air, gently pull back for a little bit of color, and then we switch back to the air to dry it on the model. Once that first glaze is dry, we pull back a little bit more, get a bit more color onto the model, and then back to air to dry it out. And so we're constantly just lightly pulling back, releasing a bit of color at a time, just a little bit of water, and then air to dry. That way, when we airbrush our glaze onto the model, it's not going to be a super heavy, watery mix. It's just going to be a nice thin coat that we then dry immediately with the airbrush. And we just go back and forth, release a bit of paint, dry. Release a bit of paint, dry. And that's the motion that we're doing. We're just lightly releasing and drying, releasing and drying. The second part of this is we want to spray from underneath. So rather than spray top down where our highlights are coming from, we're going to actually spray from the reverse where our shadows are coming from. What this will allow us to do is the color will actually catch onto the shadowed portions of the model, and it won't catch on the raised edges from this direction. So the raised edges from this direction will remain relatively untouched, and when we're spraying from down here, it's only going to catch on these bottom undercut portions that are going to be in shadow. What this allows us to do is reinforce or reestablish some of those shadows. It's going to be very, very light. It's like we're glazing by hand. It's going to be very controlled. The colors that we're going to use, we're going to quickly start with Crimson, which is sort of our mid-tone to help establish some of our mid-tones. We don't want to go too dark immediately, and we're going to focus this color primarily in this lower third portion right here and on the tips of the menhir. We're then going to switch over to Hexed Lichen, and we're going to focus that entirely on the bottom third just to keep it dark. Okay, we're going to avoid putting too much of this in the corners. So as you can see, it's almost already at the brightness or tone we want. We just want to help smooth out some of the bottom. So before I start the compressor, make all the noise, I'm going to show you my mix. So just 1 or 2 drops of flow improver. Because this mixture is mostly water, we don't need too much flow improver. I'm going to put about a half cup, or I'm going to fill half the cup with water. And then we're going to take our crimson, make sure it's shaken up nice and well. And one of the benefits of having a color that's already heavily diluted in the bottle, it lends itself very well to this sort of glazing effect. So we're only going to put just a little bit of color in the pot, swirl it in like our base coating step so that it doesn't settle in the bottom. Make sure it's nice and evenly mixed. And you can see on the piece of tissue paper, as I'm putting the glaze out, it's very, very thin. It's very watery, and when it dries, it's not going to have too much color. So that's sort of the effect that we're looking for when we're spraying through the airbrush this glaze. So once again, we're holding from the bottom, and we're going to spray up. We're going to lightly pull back on the airbrush trigger, and then push forward, so we're just pushing air, and that's going to dry it out immediately. Pull back to get a bit of color, and then release. So the entire time we have the trigger pressed down, we're constantly shooting out air, but we're only going to gently pull back a little bit at a time on the trigger to get just a little bit of color, and then we get to release so that we're only spraying air again. And you can see that as it dries, the change is very subtle. It's very, very soft, and it's very gently modulating the colors to create or help smooth out that transition and add back a bit of that crimson color into the shadows. And again, because we're modulating a little bit of color at a time, and then we're spraying air to help dry it out, it's not really pooling on the surface. It's not a lot of liquid on the model. It's just enough to get the color on, and then air to dry it out. And then we're going to repeat that for the backside. Once we're happy with that, we're then going to empty out our airbrush. We're going to switch over to our Hexed Lichen and do the exact same, focusing on the bottom of the menhir. The next step is to refine the cracks in the black stone, as well as sort of reinforce these glyph shapes. You can choose to gloss varnish the model at this point if you want. I'm choosing not to, simply because I'm not too worried. I'm not going to be erasing too much, and any errors with the glaze or any sort of messiness with the glaze, I can just go back in and refine with my highlights in the next step after this. So I'm just going to save a bit of time and go straight to the oils right on top of the acrylics. So we're just using a small amount of black oil paint. Going to mix it in with some of our mineral spirits to create a wash, and then we're going to pick out these cracks. You'll have to gauge or just sort of estimate how much oil to thinner that you want to mix with. Do a test either on a spare model or just on one of the bottom cracks and see how dark you end up wanting it to be. I don't want it to be pitch black. I just want it dark enough to help, I guess, just reinforce some of those shadows that we lost a bit with the airbrushing. You can see with these cracks, because it's so watery of a mix, I'm really just dabbing it into these larger corners where these cracks join, and the capillary action of the oils is going to pull the color into the crack. Now, when it comes to oil washing the runes, because this model was designed in CAD, Games Workshop has been able to introduce or create these very, very fine, very ornate detail elements that unfortunately aren't very well defined or embossed into the model, which can make it tricky to do a wash on top of. So this step is going to get a little messy, and unfortunately, we're going to have to go back in with our fuchsia and just reestablish the highlights along those runes. I'm going to go a little heavier with my wash here. I'm going to mix in a bit more pigment because I want these runes to get a little darker and be a little more defined. Now, the reason I didn't do this step before doing the initial textural highlights with the crimson and fuchsia is because I wanted to be able to be very quick and rough when I was applying the initial brush texture. And that's something I can't do if I'm worried about maintaining these glyphs, particularly these glyphs, a little bit the cracks, but not so much. I wanted to be able to keep my initial texturing very loose, very freeform, very quick. And so I chose to do this oil wash step after, and then go back in once the oil is dry and only pick out problem spots where the oil dried a little messily. Now, because this oil wash is very heavily diluted, there's not a lot of pigment, not a lot of oil. This will only really take as long as the mineral spirits will take to evaporate to fully dry, which isn't too long. By the time I'm finished this other side, the first will probably be dry. And what we can do afterwards is go back in with some pure mineral spirits and just try and clean up our edges a little bit to try and reduce some of our work afterwards when it comes to re-highlighting. Okay, so you can see that this flip side is basically dry. There's a couple of spots that are a little messy, and even though I didn't gloss varnish it, just going back in with a bit of mineral spirits and a clean brush, we're able to just lightly erase some of these mistakes. And this will help save us a little bit of work when it comes afterwards to highlighting or just re-establishing our highlights. Just make sure that you don't apply too much mineral spirits, otherwise you'll reactivate the pigment that's already in the creases and pull out the color. I'm just doing a second wash on some of the glyphs that aren't quite dark enough. Now this is one of those spots or one of those details that you don't have to spend too much detail on, too much time on. Um, Honestly speaking, especially for a tabletop model, you don't really notice these runes. Um, if you look at the photos of Games Workshop's Menhirs, and even looking at this model, from however far away, unless you're really pushing those highlights back, you barely notice that they're there, right? So yes, spend a bit of time to find them. I want my models to look pretty good at close inspection, so I spend a little more time refining these little details, but you don't really have to spend too much time on them if you don't want. They're not really a noticeable element. So we're going to set that aside to let the mineral spirits fully evaporate, just to be safe, and then we're going to go back in with our acrylic paints, fuchsia in particular, reestablish some of our highlights, and then we're going to start highlighting the central portion to reflect the glow of the orb. So with the mineral spirits fully dry, it's now time to go back in and just touch up some of our highlights, neaten up some of these potential overpaints, and then highlight a little more to begin reinforcing this light glow in the center radius. So we're going to start at, using Scale Colors Fuchsia for this. We're going to reestablish our highlights, our initial edge highlights that we had on the stone, and then we're going to start mixing in Hykey Yellow into the fuchsia to get this brighter portion brightened up. So I'm being really careful at this step now to not get paint into the recesses of the sun rays or energy rays, whatever they are, the cracks in the stone and in the runes when I get to them. So these guys, I'm just going to very carefully paint around the lines to pick out the shapes. And as you work your way across the model and down into this portion of right over here, don't forget to maintain this blend that we have, right? You don't want to take these highlights too far down and brighten up this portion too much because then it'll stand out compared to the rest of the model. We still have some crimson on our palette, so if you want to mix the two colors together uh, to highlight these portions and help refine them, that's also good too. It'll keep the tones fairly consistent with what's around it, and we can help use that to refine some of these shapes. And we're going to repeat this step on the other side of the menhir. So now that we've touched up our highlights with the fuchsia, it's time to start adding a bit of, or to start pushing our highlights with the Hykey Yellow to push it towards this brightness along the center of or the edge of the central ring. So we're just going to take our Hykey Yellow and we're just going to be mixing it in progressive amounts with our fuchsia. And try not to go too overboard with this. We want to maintain the color of the pink. We don't want to push it too far into this yellowed yellow. It's not white. It is still a pink, but it does get pretty pale. Now I'm keeping this step nice and loose. It's one of those things where I don't care so much about having a perfect blend. I am more interested in the texture of the piece and in letting the brush strokes tell a story, to add a bit of that imperfection, that life to it. And then because this is a tabletop gaming piece, when you look at it from 3, 4, 5 feet away, the mind is going to perceive it as a blend anyways, right? When you look at this piece, you don't see all the roughness of it. You just see it's got that glow effect. It's vibrant. When we pull up close, you can actually see that it's fairly sloppy. It's fairly messy. It's very textural. You can see the different strokes. And we could spend forever perfecting our blends. I know I can do it. I just don't want to. So we're going to use these radius lines as a guide for how far to push or to take these highlights. We don't want to extend it too far beyond them. We just want the effect to be nice and subtle. I am focusing some highlights on the edges around these major channels, because I go back in afterwards and I paint them with the same blue energy lines as the orbs. And so I want to give that illusion that they're also reflecting a bit of light within them. Okay, and then we're just going to add a bit more Hykey Yellow and take this just a step brighter, focusing right along the edge. And you're once again being careful to maintain the definition in a lot of these recessed cracks and rune work. Okay, so the next step before we do a final edge highlight on picking out some of these edges is to tackle the glowing effect on the inside of the rune. So you just want to make a quick double check and make sure that these inside panels are highlighted with or painted with pure fuchsia. If they're not, or if they're a little muddy, just go back in and just touch up some of those panels. So to do the inner glow, we're going to now start mixing our Caribbean blue from Scale Color into our fuchsia. And that's going to give us this nice sort of purplish tone that we're going to use to layer on the inside. And our goal is to reach almost pure Caribbean blue on the inner element. Again, much like the outer glow, I'm not trying to make a perfect blend. I want to give a I want to have that texture in the model, and then two, it's the effect will sell itself from 3, 4, 5 feet away on the tabletop, and even upon closer inspection, once you get all the colors in there, the brain has a way of interpreting data and sort of smoothing in the gaps. So even though something might not be perfectly blended, our brain is going to perceive, because it's got all these different colors side by side, that there is some sort of a gradient there. And so when we layer in this initial color, this purple color, or I guess it's kind of like lilac, we're going to leave a bit of that fuchsia showing near the outer edges. Okay. And then we're going to go back in and do another highlight, this time with more Caribbean blue. And we're just going to leave a little bit more of that lilac showing. And you can see I'm being very careful to maintain or to keep this paint from getting into the rays. If you do get some of your paint into the crevices, it's not a problem. You can just go back in with some diluted black paint or a dark bluish purple and just refine those lines. And then we're just going to keep adding more and more Caribbean blue until we've reached pure Caribbean blue in the center. Now, when we get to pure Caribbean blue, we're going to paint the orb connectors, as well as the entire inner lining of this circle. And that will then provide our base coat to do our oxide wash. And then we can then proceed to paint the orb like we do the other blue energy elements of the models. Okay. And now I'm going to repeat all of this on the other side while I wait for the Caribbean blue to dry. And then I'm going to do a few more base coats of this Caribbean blue to make sure that we have a strong, even base coat on the orb. And then we'll proceed to our next step. Now that our base coat of Caribbean blue is nice and dry, we're going to apply a wash of oxide over the orb And then we're going to tint the inner glow of the circle panels, just like we tint the color of the blue energy. It's the same thing. You want to make sure that you apply your wash to the inner. Oh shit. This is my life. You want to make sure that you apply your oxide wash to the inner panel of the Menhir as well. And this is the main reason why I didn't paint the orb in the center first as well before painting the rest of the Menhir. It means I can afford to be a little sloppy at this stage and not have to worry about overpainting or correcting the orb. Okay, and then we're also going to take the oxide and we're going to fade on these angled edges as well, these surfaces. We want to make sure, however, that we maintain some of that lilac and fuchsia along the edges. So we're really only just looking to add a bit of color to the inner edge, and then we're going to pull it out like a glaze. Now that we've glazed our oxide in, it's time to apply our final highlights. So the first highlight we're going to apply is going to be on the edge of the outer ring right here. And we're going to pull on the lines or the edges towards the circle. We're not going to go all the way to the bottom because that's going to be our second highlight. Our second highlight to follow is going to be a mix of oxide and white. We're going to highlight the inner edge of this circle, and then we're going to pull the lines out towards the outer circle, or towards the outer edge. And this overlap will help create a bit of that transition and to give the illusion that it's a glowing highlight. So to highlight the outer ring, we're just going to use our fuchsia and Hykey Yellow mix again. Only this time we're going to go very heavily into Hykey Yellow so that it's brighter than what we have on the model so far. We're going to make sure we dilute our paints very nicely. Just paint a fine line running all the way around. I'm going to concentrate some of this highlight as well on the edges facing these deeper channels, just to add a bit of definition to them. And then we're going to highlight both halves of the lines, or the radial lines coming from the center. Now again, note that I'm not pulling the lines all the way to the center because we're going to go back in from the inside out and apply our blue-white highlight. Now, if you're wondering if this is an awkward model to hold and paint, the answer is yes. It most certainly is. We're now going to take Oxide and Vallejo White, and we're going to highlight the inner circle and inner edges. So first we start with a approximate 50-50-ish mix. And we're going to do the same thing in reverse. We're going to highlight the inner edge and the lines pulling out. And for our final highlight, we want to concentrate a stronger, almost white, not quite white, towards these corners and edges near the channels. Major channels right here. Now remember, because this is object source lighting or pseudo object source lighting, that your reflected light, so what I'm painting right now, should never be brighter than the source of your light itself. So because I take these blue energy orbs pretty much to pure white, I can't use pure white on these OSL highlights. And that's all I do for the pink on my Blackstone, quote unquote Blackstone. So painting the rest of the Menhir is basically the same as painting the rest of my Necrons. I paint the outer trim as the white ivory armor. I paint these engine exhausts in the black, and I will paint the orbs with my blue energy recipe. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and don't forget to check out the other videos in my Necron Szarekh series. Don't forget to subscribe for more awesome weekly content, and to check out my Instagram as John the Ho for daily updates on my hobby projects. Until next time, happy hobbying.